This is Catherine Schneider from the Fitchburg Historical Society. We are very excited to announce our fall program, which will be on prisoner of war camps in Wisconsin. And it will be taking place at the Fitchburg Public Library on Sunday, November 9th at 1:30 in the afternoon. And we'd like to invite the public to that very interesting program. And today we actually have our speaker who is going to be presenting the program with us to preview it for us. This is Bob Block, and Bob is retired from the Wisconsin Crime Lab, where he spent many years, and he also is an active member of the Oregon Area Historical Society. So welcome, Bob. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And why don't we just start right off with maybe you filling us in a little bit on your background and what drew you to the topic of prisoner of war camps in Wisconsin.
All right, as you mentioned, I am retired after working 34 years at the Wisconsin Crime Lab here in Madison, Wisconsin. And I was head of the drug identification unit at the laboratory. And I testified in courts over 500 times for state and federal court. And then after retirement, I became an active member of the Oregon Historical Society in Oregon, and I'm still an active member.
And then I wondered, what drew you into the topic of prisoner of war camps in
Yes,
Wisconsin?
that's an interesting story. Without giving a lot of information, I'll simply tell you that I got interested in POWs primarily because in 2024, the Oregon Senior Center asked the Historical Society if we'd provide a speaker for their Veterans Day service that they have at the Senior Center. And I volunteered to do a presentation on POWs. And to just give you a hint of how this came about, it all started with a wooden crate. And you might wonder, how does a wooden crate get you interested in POWs? And that crate has a story of its own. And I'm going to save that for the presentation.
Wonderful.
So you need to come to the presentation. You'll find out how that crate got me interested in POWs.
That sounds wonderful. What a great way to attract people to the presentation,
Sure.
Bob. Well, how'd you go about researching prisoner of war camps? And then I was wondering, is it difficult to find information about the camps?
In terms of information regarding U.S. POWs and POW camps, most of that simply came via internet researching. In terms of Wisconsin POW camps, the primary source for that presentation is a book called Stalag, Wisconsin by Betty Cowley, who is a history teacher in Altoona. And her students were very surprised when she would tell them that Altoona was once the home of a POW camp. And so that's the source for that. It is somewhat difficult to find information about some specific camps because much of the information regarding war stories, POW, or POW camps were censored during the war. So it is somewhat difficult to get that information. Betty Colley will mention in her book when she does her research that information was difficult to get because of the fact stories were censored and the stories regarding the branch camps in the National Archives was destroyed in the 1950s. So much of her information comes from interviews that she did with individuals that either were a prisoner of war, they worked with a prisoner of war, or they lived in a community that had a POW camp.
So primary sources were used then by her actually talking to people who were involved in the camps in some way.
Correct, for her book, yes.
Well, then I was wondering if there were surprises you uncovered in the stories of the prisoner of war camps.
Well, the surprising thing to me is that the fact that there were POW camps in Wisconsin during World War II, and that there were actually 39 of them housing 20,000 POWs.
That's a significant number, Bob.
It is. The U.S. will have over 425,000 POWs. Wisconsin will have about 20,000 of those. Then in terms of not a lot of surprises, but a lot of interesting information about the POW camps. And maybe if there's anything surprising was I guess I would say the living conditions of these POWs. And some of the stories are quite humorous. And Wisconsin and the U.S. treated their POWs very humanely following the Geneva Convention. And you'll find from some of these stories that camp life as a POW in the U.S. was not a real difficult thing to have to do during World War II. And so you'll find some very interesting stories, and you'll find out why many of them didn't want to leave the U.S. after the war because of their treatment here in the POW camps.
That's so interesting, because I think one tends to think of a prisoner of war camp as a difficult place to be and spend time, and yet to know that prisoners of war here were treated so humanely. So also of interest, I think, to people is where were those prisoner of war camps located, those 20,000 prisoners? Where were they kept?
In Wisconsin
In
or
Wisconsin,
the U.S.?
in Wisconsin.
They were spread throughout the state of Wisconsin. And people will often ask me the question, did we have POW camps here in Wisconsin because we had a large German descendant population? And the answer to that is no. They came to Wisconsin to work because we had work for them to do. And the primary work that they would do would be harvesting, working on farms, orchards, and canneries. In the 1930s, Wisconsin will have 171 canneries, and I was quite surprised by that. And by the 1940s, and those would be individually owned, so Stokely would just own that one cannery. By the 1940s, they started buying them up and merging them, so Stokely may now have several canneries throughout the state. And in the 1940s, Wisconsin was canning about half of the vegetables in the entire United States.
Oh, what a surprise.
So it was quite interesting. And again, these are all little sidelights that you run into and learn while you're doing the research on the POWs and the camps.
And so the camps, just to give context for those years of the camps, would the camps have been open then all during World War II, the United States' time in World War II, 1940, probably 1942 through 1945 approximately, or would you have the years?
In Wisconsin, the first POW camp opened in early 1942. Although it had been open prior to that, and there would be camps throughout the United States prior to that, that were serving as internment camps for any Germans, Italians, or Japanese thought to be a threat to the U.S. In Wisconsin, it then opened as a POW camp in 1942, and all of the camps would then eventually close, with the last of them closing in June of 1946.
Okay. Even a little bit beyond the close of World War II.
Yes.
That's so interesting. Without giving away too much from your presentation on November 9th at the library, could you give us just a couple of teasers maybe about why the public should come to the presentation on POW camps?
Sure. What I do is the introduction to this presentation. I present 5 questions, and they will be addressed throughout the presentation. And those 5 questions are, why did the POWs come to the United States? Where did they come from? How did they get here? Where did they go once they arrived? And what happened to them after the war ended? And so that kind of summarizes what's going to be covered during the presentation. And so the first part of the presentation will cover U.S. POWs and POW camps, addressing those questions. The second half of the presentation deals specifically with Wisconsin POW camps, and it answers that last question. what happened to them after the war ended.
Great.
So it kind of gives you a quick overview of what the presentation will tell.
Oh, thank you, Bob. I'm just excited just hearing
Sure.
about the outline of what you'll be covering during your presentation. And then if people are interested in things, after hearing your presentation, are there other ways they can find out more about the prisoner of war camps?
There is, obviously, internet researching. There are a number of books written about POWs and POW camps. There are other books related to the POW camps. You won't find much in the way of the National Archives. If a community, or you're aware of a community or state that had a POW camp, there are records of those in the archives. And if you're interested in a particular camp, you would have to research that. But because so many of these were around for such short periods, just months in some cases, it is difficult to find information about a lot of these specific camps. But there is information to be found on U.S. POWs, and there's tons of information about POWs in Germany, Russia, and Japan. And again, treatment there is much, much different for those POWs than they were here in the U.S.
Thank you for that information, Bob. And then your presentation is on Sunday, November 9th at the library. So the Fitchburg Historical Society actually chose that date because it's the Sunday before Veterans Day. So my question to you is, could you speak about what you think prisoner of war camps tell us about those who served their country in the military?
Yeah, and it's kind of a difficult question to answer. And so let me address it this way. It's been 80 years since we've had any POW camps here in the U.S. regarding back to World War II. And even myself, in my formal education that I had growing up, nobody ever talked about World War II camps. And so obviously today's generation would know nothing about these camps. So historically, those camps probably have little relationship to anything that's going on in the world today. But I think what it tells us something about the soldiers in terms of that time period, that these men were willing to sacrifice their life to fight for our nation, knowing that there was a risk that they could be captured and become a POW. And while the POWs in the U.S. were treated very humanely, again, following the Geneva Convention, to the point where some of them didn't want to have to return to their home countries following the war, that is quite different than the Americans who were in a German or a Japanese POW camp, and in many cases would suffer dearly to the point of not surviving captivity or having very, very much physical or psychological damage done to them. And so they made a great sacrifice for our country, whether they, when they served, knowing that that was a possibility of either being killed or being captured and being held as a POW.
Thank you, Bob. That is so well said, and I think our memorials on Veterans Day are remembrances of the sacrifices of those who have served their country is so important to bring to mind.
Sure.
My last question for you today is what it was like for you personally to look at POW camp history in Wisconsin, and do you think that history still impacts us today?
Yeah, I enjoyed doing the research and finding that information. I enjoyed the stories from the Wisconsin camps. It gave me a different viewpoint of that time of history. As I mentioned, I came around after that time period, so I was not around during World War II. So I found it very entertaining and enjoyable, and the stories were quite interesting. And what I've found is that I enjoy doing this presentation for senior centers and continuous care campuses, because it is that generation that lived through this time period. And it's quite interesting that while I do that presentation, I can see many of the memories coming back. And unfortunately, we don't have many people around anymore that actually were fighting in the war during World War II. I do run into a few, and it's quite a pleasure to meet those people and talk to them. Many of the people that do come from that time period, they were children during that time. And they share their stories with me about seeing the POWs. And so there is a reality to them that this did happen, they were there, and they were part of it. And it's always kind of fun to see that memory coming back and sharing their stories with them.
That's wonderful. So bringing forth those stories from the past and touching those people who remember them, and then bringing these stories forward for a new generation, Bob.
Sure.
All of those things you're accomplishing through your presentations. So we're very much looking forward to your presentation then, and I'll just repeat that the presentation will be on Sunday, November 9th, 1:30 in the afternoon at the Fitchburg Public Library. And we'd also like to just remind people that Fitchburg Historical Society can be found online, fitchburghistory.org, and we just encourage people to enjoy that website and all the information that's available there on Fitchburg history.